My wealthy roommate needed a fake boyfriend at his family's hotel gala. He chose me. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to ask for one small favor. If you enjoy heartfelt, dramatic, and unforgettable stories, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss any of our upcoming videos. It only takes a second, costs absolutely nothing, and it helps us continue creating more emotional stories for you. Your support truly means more than words can express. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from today. Share your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let's return to our main character. The easiest lies to tell are the ones that begin with the truth. That was the thought running through my head on the afternoon everything changed, although I had no idea just how much my ordinary life was about to unravel. My name is Noah Carter, and if you had asked anyone who knew me a week earlier to describe me, they probably would have said I was dependable, quiet, and permanently exhausted. I was 24 years old, finishing my final semester in a hospitality management program while working evening shifts at a boutique hotel just outside downtown Chicago. Between tuition, rent, textbooks, and a student loan balance that seemed to grow every month no matter how carefully I budgeted, life had become a constant exercise in stretching every dollar as far as it could possibly go. My apartment reflected that reality perfectly. It was a modest two-bedroom unit with squeaky hardwood floors, an aging coffee maker that only brewed when it felt inspired, and a refrigerator that buzzed loudly enough to sound like it had opinions about our grocery choices. I shared that apartment with Adrian Sterling. We had been roommates for a little over a year after answering the same online rental listing, and despite living under the same roof almost every day, I realized I knew surprisingly little about him. Adrian paid his half of the rent on time, never left dirty dishes in the sink, replaced the toilet paper before it was completely gone, and somehow managed to make even carrying laundry down the hallway look effortless. He claimed he worked as a financial consultant, traveled often for meetings, and answered enough business calls to make the explanation believable. I never questioned it. Honestly, I was too busy trying to survive my own schedule to wonder why someone with expensive tailored jackets always chose to live in an apartment where the thermostat had only two settings, freezing and tropical. We developed an easy rhythm that never required many words. I made pancakes on Sunday mornings, and Adrian always cleaned the skillet afterward. If one of us got home late, the other would leave dinner in the microwave with a sticky note that simply read, "Heat for 2 minutes." It wasn't friendship in the traditional sense, but it was comfortable, familiar, and strangely reassuring. Sometimes, after long shifts, we'd sit on the fire escape with paper cups of coffee, watching the city lights shimmer against Lake Michigan while exchanging stories about impossible customers or ridiculous coworkers. Those quiet conversations became my favorite part of the week, even if I never admitted it out loud. Everything about that ordinary routine ended on a rainy Thursday evening. I unlocked our apartment door expecting silence, but instead found Adrian standing in the living room wearing a charcoal suit that looked far too expensive for someone who claimed to spend his days studying investment reports. His expression was unusually serious. Before I could even set my backpack down, he looked directly at me and said, "Noah, I need you to pretend to be my boyfriend for 3 days." I laughed because it sounded like the opening line of a terrible romantic comedy. Adrian didn't laugh back. Instead, he reached into a leather folder resting on the kitchen counter, slid a neatly prepared agreement across the table, and quietly added, "My family's hotel gala is this weekend, and you're the only person I trust enough to ask." I stared at the agreement for several long seconds, convinced there had to be a hidden camera somewhere in the apartment. Adrian remained perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the kitchen counter as though asking your roommate to pose as your boyfriend for a family gala was an everyday inconvenience. I finally looked up at him and let out a nervous laugh. "You cannot be serious." His expression never changed. "I wish I were joking." The silence stretched between us until the humming refrigerator became the loudest thing in the room. I picked up the first page of the contract, expecting to find some elaborate prank, but instead it was written with astonishing professionalism. It outlined dates, travel arrangements, public appearances, and even a confidentiality clause. There was no mention of romance, No ridiculous conditions, only the expectation that we would convincingly appear to be a committed couple during a weekend of family events. I lowered the papers slowly. Adrian? Who exactly is your family? He hesitated for the first time since I had walked through the door. Then he quietly answered, the Sterling family owns Sterling Hotels. I blinked twice. The Sterling Hotels? He nodded once. The luxury chain. Every memory from the past year suddenly rearranged itself inside my head. The expensive watches he never talked about. The business trips on impossibly short notice. The calls that always ended with phrases like board approval and acquisition. Even the tailored suits that somehow looked ordinary on him. I had ignored every clue because I had accepted the simple explanation he gave me. My roommate was not a financial consultant. He was the heir to one of the largest luxury hotel companies in the country. Why are you living here? I asked before I could stop myself. Adrian smiled faintly, but there was sadness behind it. Because it is the only place where nobody expects me to be someone else. That answer lingered in the room far longer than I expected. I suddenly realized I had never seen him truly relaxed anywhere except this tiny apartment with its squeaky floors and unreliable appliances. He was not pretending here. He was simply Adrian. So why do you suddenly need a fake boyfriend? I asked. He exhaled slowly and looked out the rain-speckled window. Every year my family hosts a gala at our flagship hotel. This year my grandfather plans to announce the next chief executive officer. My relatives believe stability matters more than ability. They want someone who fits their image. They also expect me to accept an arranged relationship with the son of one of our business partners. I frowned. And you do not want that?
No.
His answer came instantly. I have spent my entire life making decisions for everyone else. This time I want one choice that belongs to me. He met my eyes again. His calm voice carrying an honesty I had never heard before. If I arrive with someone I have already chosen, the arrangement ends before it begins. I looked back at the agreement in my hands, then around the apartment that suddenly felt impossibly small. Why me? Adrian stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough that I could see the quiet sincerity in his expression. Because you have never treated me differently, even when you had every reason to judge me. Around you, I remember who I actually am. I cannot fake that with anyone else. My heartbeat quickened for reasons I could not entirely explain. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, a simple favor between roommates. Yet standing there beneath the flickering kitchen light, I had the unmistakable feeling that the weekend ahead was going to test far more than our ability to convince a room full of strangers. I should have said no. Every practical thought in my head insisted that pretending to be the boyfriend of the heir to a luxury hotel empire was the kind of decision that ruined otherwise uncomplicated lives. Yet somehow, less than 48 hours later, I found myself sitting across from Adrian at our tiny kitchen table while he calmly explained the difference between his great-aunt Eleanor and his Aunt Victoria as though confusing them might trigger an international incident. Eleanor collects antique jewelry, he said, sliding a page of handwritten notes toward me. Victoria collects embarrassing stories about everyone else. If she asks personal questions, smile first and answer slowly. I laughed despite myself. You really have a strategy for every relative? Adrian rubbed the back of his neck with an expression that looked almost sheepish. Years of experience. Over the next 2 evenings, our apartment transformed into the world's strangest rehearsal studio. We practiced how we had supposedly met, which restaurant had been our first date, which movie we had watched together on our first weekend as a couple, and even which side of the bed each of us supposedly preferred. Every answer had to sound natural because wealthy families, according to Adrian, noticed details before they noticed emotions. At one point he suddenly asked, "What is my favorite coffee?" I blinked. Black. 1 packet of raw sugar when you have not slept enough. He looked genuinely surprised. How did you know that? I shrugged. Because I have lived with you for over a year. A slow smile crossed his face before he quietly replied, "Right?" That smile lingered with me far longer than it probably should have. The rehearsals became easier after that. We stopped sounding like actors memorizing lines and started talking the way we always had. The only difference was that now we occasionally had to stand closer together. Family photos, Adrian explained one afternoon. People naturally close the distance. He demonstrated by standing beside me until our shoulders lightly touched. My heartbeat became embarrassingly aware of itself. Too stiff, he said gently. Relax. Easy for you to say, I muttered. You are not pretending to date your roommate. A quiet laugh escaped him. Neither are you if you keep looking that terrified. Even I had to laugh at that. The tension dissolved almost instantly. By Friday morning, we drove toward the Sterling Grand Hotel in one of the company cars waiting outside our apartment building. As Chicago's skyline reflected across the polished windows, I caught my first glimpse of the hotel rising above the surrounding streets. It looked less like a building and more like a landmark, its glass exterior shining beneath the afternoon sun, while neatly dressed staff welcomed arriving guests with effortless precision. I instinctively reached for my backpack before remembering I had traded it for a garment bag containing the nicest suit I had ever owned. You are thinking about leaving, Adrian observed without taking his eyes off the entrance. Was it that obvious? He nodded once. You always tap your thumb against your knee when you are nervous. I froze. You noticed that? A long time ago. His answer was quiet, almost absent-minded. But something about it settled my nerves more effectively than any reassuring speech could have. The valet opened the car door, and suddenly cameras flashed near the front entrance as more guests arrived. I swallowed hard. This world was brighter, louder, and infinitely more polished than anything I had ever experienced. Adrian stepped out first, then turned back toward me. Instead of offering instructions, he simply extended his hand. Ready? I looked at the hotel, at the crowd waiting beyond those enormous glass doors, and finally at the man who had trusted me with the biggest secret of his life. I took a slow breath, placed my hand in his, and realized the performance had already begun long before either of us walked inside. The Sterling Grand Hotel somehow became even more intimidating once we stepped inside. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors. A pianist filled the enormous lobby with soft jazz, and elegantly dressed guests moved through the space with the effortless confidence of people who had never worried about overdraft fees or late rent notices. I tried not to stare, but everything looked like it belonged on the cover of a luxury travel magazine. Adrian, on the other hand, walked as though he had memorized every corner of the building before he learned to drive. Every employee greeted him respectfully, but there was something different in their expressions. It was not admiration. It was expectation. They all seemed to be waiting to see whether he would become the next leader of the company. Smile, Adrian whispered without looking at me. You look like you are preparing for a final exam. This feels harder than my final exams, I whispered back. A quiet laugh escaped him just as an elegant woman approached us wearing a navy evening gown and a string of pearls that probably cost more than my college tuition. Adrian, she said warmly before, turning toward me. And this must be Noah. Adrian nodded. Noah. This is my Aunt Eleanor. I immediately remembered the notes. Antique jewelry. Kind eyes. Loved, thoughtful conversation. It is wonderful to meet you, I said. Adrian told me how much you enjoy restoring vintage pieces. I have always admired people who preserve history instead of replacing it. Her face brightened instantly. Well, now I understand why my nephew speaks so highly of you. I glanced sideways at Adrian. He looked almost surprised by her reaction. As Aunt Eleanor drifted toward another group of guests, Adrian leaned closer and quietly said, You handled that better than most executives do. I studied, I replied with a grin. Apparently, the next hour passed in a blur of introductions, conversations, and carefully rehearsed stories that somehow no longer felt rehearsed. Every time someone asked how we met, Adrian would look at me first before smiling, and somehow that tiny pause made the answer feel believable. I began to relax. Maybe we could actually survive the weekend. That illusion shattered the moment a familiar voice echoed across the ballroom. Adrian, it has been a long time. We both turned toward a tall man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo walking confidently through the crowd. He carried himself with the ease of someone who had spent his entire life attending events exactly like this one. Adrian's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Landon," he said politely. The name alone told me everything. This was the business partner's son Adrian had mentioned. Landon looked at me with a courteous smile that never reached his eyes. "So you are Noah." He extended his hand, and I shook it. His grip was firm, but his attention remained fixed on Adrian. "Your family certainly enjoys surprises," Adrian answered evenly. "Life would be boring without them." Landon chuckled. "Perhaps, although people do tend to ask questions when someone appears out of nowhere right before a succession announcement." The words sounded pleasant enough, yet the meaning beneath them landed like cold rain. I felt dozens of nearby conversations quietly fading as people pretended not to listen. Landon studied my suit, then my watch, then the hotel around us before offering a sympathetic smile. "Adjusting to this world cannot be easy." Before I could answer, Adrian calmly stepped forward until we stood shoulder to shoulder. His voice remained composed, but every word carried unmistakable conviction. "Noah does not need to adjust to impress anyone here. He already impresses the only opinion that matters to me." The silence that followed felt heavier than the music filling the ballroom. For the first time since arriving, I forgot we were supposed to be pretending, because nothing about the way Adrian looked at me in that moment felt rehearsed. The applause that followed the opening remarks of the evening sounded polished and enthusiastic, but beneath the elegant atmosphere I could sense an invisible competition unfolding at every table. Conversations were measured, smiles were carefully practiced, and every glance seemed to carry a question about who would eventually inherit the future of Sterling Hotels. Adrian introduced me to board members, longtime investors, and family friends with calm confidence, never once hesitating when he called me his partner. The strange part was that hearing him say those words no longer felt as awkward as it had inside our apartment kitchen. Somewhere between the rehearsals and the ballroom, our performance had started to resemble something unexpectedly natural. During dinner, I noticed Adrian barely touched his meal. He answered questions with grace, listened more than he spoke, and quietly thanked every server who approached our table by name. Several employees smiled with genuine warmth whenever he did. That simple habit revealed more about his character than any speech ever could. He remembered people. He respected them. I suddenly understood why so many staff members seemed hopeful whenever they looked in his direction. As dessert was served, Adrian's grandfather entered the ballroom. Every conversation immediately softened into silence. Even before anyone whispered his name, I knew exactly who he was. Richard Sterling carried himself with quiet authority rather than flashy confidence. His silver hair, tailored black tuxedo, and thoughtful expression gave him the presence of someone who had spent decades building not only hotels but an entire legacy. Adrian stood as his grandfather approached our table. "Grandfather," Richard smiled gently before turning toward me. "So you are Noah." I extended my hand respectfully. "It is an honor to meet you, sir." Instead of shaking my hand immediately, he studied my face for a brief moment that felt much longer. Finally, he smiled and accepted the handshake. My grandson rarely surprises me anymore. Tonight, he managed to do exactly that. His tone carried curiosity rather than criticism, and I found myself relaxing. We spoke for several minutes about hospitality, customer service, and my studies. To my surprise, Richard seemed genuinely interested in my experiences working evening shifts at a small hotel. He listened closely as I described how remembering returning guests by name often mattered more than expensive decorations. "People remember how they are treated long after they forget what the lobby looked like," I said. Richard nodded thoughtfully. An observation some executives spend years failing to learn. Adrian quietly smiled beside me without saying a word. Before Richard could continue, another family member approached holding a sleek black folder. "Sir, I believe these documents require your review before the announcement." Richard accepted the folder absent-mindedly while continuing our conversation. A few moments later, he was called away toward the stage. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until I noticed a familiar sheet of paper partially sticking out from inside the folder. My heartbeat immediately stumbled. The formatting, the signature lines, the unmistakable layout. It looked exactly like the agreement Adrian had handed me in our apartment. My eyes widened as realization swept over me. Somehow our private contract had found its way into the folder meant for Richard Sterling. Adrian followed my gaze and instantly understood what I had seen. The color quietly drained from his face. Across the ballroom, Landon stood near one of the columns, watching us with an unreadable expression before slowly lifting a glass in our direction as though acknowledging a move in a chess match only he could appreciate. Adrian whispered only 2 words beneath his breath. Not now. But Richard had already reached the podium, opened the folder in front of hundreds of distinguished guests, and began turning the pages, completely unaware that the truth hidden between them was only seconds away from changing every carefully rehearsed plan we had made. Richard Sterling paused as he reached the unexpected pages inside the folder. The confidence in the ballroom quietly dissolved into puzzled silence while he lowered his reading glasses and examined the document more carefully. From where I stood, I could see the unmistakable heading of the agreement Adrian had prepared only days earlier. It was impossible to mistake. A private contract describing our arrangement had somehow become part of the official papers for the evening's announcement. Murmurs spread from table to table like a ripple across still water. Richard looked toward Adrian with calm confusion rather than anger. "Adrian," he said evenly, "perhaps you should explain why this appears to be a signed agreement describing a temporary relationship." Every eye in the ballroom shifted toward us. I felt my face grow warm as countless strangers waited for an answer. Before I could say anything, Landon slowly stepped forward from the edge of the crowd with an expression that looked almost sympathetic. "I am afraid I should accept responsibility," he said smoothly. "While reviewing documents earlier today, someone accidentally mixed a personal file into the presentation folder. I only noticed moments ago." His apology sounded polite, yet there was something rehearsed about every carefully chosen word. Adrian studied him for a long second before quietly asking, "Accidentally?" Landon held his gaze without hesitation. "That is what I was told." Adrian understood exactly what had happened. So did I. But proving it would accomplish nothing now. Richard folded the agreement and placed it carefully on the podium. "Is the document authentic?" he asked. Adrian did not look away. "Yes." The single word echoed through the silent ballroom. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, believing everything was over. The succession announcement, Adrian's reputation, and perhaps even our friendship had all collapsed within seconds. I expected Adrian to continue defending the arrangement exactly as we had planned. Instead, he surprised everyone, including me. He walked toward the stage with calm determination until he stood beside his grandfather. Then he looked directly at the guests before speaking in a voice steady enough to silence every whisper in the room. "The agreement is real," he admitted. "When I asked Noah to come here, I believed I needed a contract because I was afraid. I thought a carefully planned arrangement would solve a complicated family expectation." He paused before turning toward me. His expression had changed completely. The practiced confidence was gone. What remained was simple honesty. But somewhere between sharing breakfasts in our apartment, late conversations after work, and watching him treat every person with kindness regardless of who they were, I realized the contract had stopped reflecting the truth. I stared at him, unable to move. Adrian continued without taking his eyes off mine. "The truth is that I stopped pretending long before this weekend began. The agreement may have started everything, but it no longer explains how I feel." A stunned silence settled over the ballroom. Even Landon looked genuinely caught off guard. Adrian slowly removed the folded contract from the podium, looked down at the pages for one final moment, and then calmly tore them in half before placing the pieces back onto the table. There was no dramatic gesture, only quiet certainty. "I will not ask Noah to continue a performance that has already become something else," he said. Then he faced me completely. "Noah, if you decide to walk away after tonight, I will understand. You never deserved to be placed in this position." But if I say anything else this evening, I want it to be without contracts, expectations, or family pressure. I chose you because I trusted you. I stayed beside you because somewhere along the way, I fell in love with the person you already were. My carefully rehearsed lines disappeared from my mind. For the first time all weekend, neither of us was pretending, and somehow that truth felt far more powerful than every perfectly planned lie that had brought us there. For several endless seconds, nobody in the ballroom moved. The orchestra had stopped playing, conversations had vanished, and even the clinking of silverware had faded into complete silence. I could hear nothing except the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. Adrian remained standing on the stage, his shoulders relaxed now that every secret had finally been spoken aloud. There was no fear left in his expression, only relief. I realized that for the first time since I had met him, he was no longer carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. Richard Sterling looked down at the torn pieces of the agreement resting on the podium before lifting his eyes toward his grandson. His face revealed neither disappointment nor approval. Instead, it carried the thoughtful expression of a man carefully measuring character rather than circumstance. "Adrian," he said quietly, "do you understand what your decision may cost you?" Adrian answered without hesitation. "Yes, sir. You may lose the opportunity to lead this company. Then I lose it honestly." Richard nodded once, as though the answer itself mattered more than the possibility it described. He turned his attention toward me. "Noah, you have been placed in a situation you never asked for. You owe this family nothing. If you wish to leave, no one here will think less of you. Every instinct told me that walking away would be the easiest choice. A week earlier I had been worried about tuition payments and broken coffee makers. Now I stood in the middle of a ballroom filled with executives, investors, and one of the wealthiest families in the country. None of this belonged to my world. Yet when I looked at Adrian, I no longer saw the heir to a luxury hotel empire. I saw the man who quietly washed breakfast dishes before I woke up, remembered to leave dinner in the microwave after my late shifts, noticed when I was stressed without my saying a word, and had trusted me with the truth long before he trusted anyone else in that room. I slowly walked toward the stage. Every step felt lighter than the one before it. When I finally stood beside Adrian, I faced Richard with complete honesty. "Sir, when Adrian first asked for my help, I believed this weekend was only about pretending. Somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about appearances and started paying attention to the person standing beside me. The wealth, the hotels, the business. None of that is why I stayed. I stayed because Adrian is kind when nobody is watching. He remembers people's names. He thanks every employee. He treats strangers with respect. Those things cannot be written into a contract." The room remained perfectly still. Richard's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Across the ballroom, I noticed several hotel employees exchanging quiet smiles with one another. They had heard every word. Landon lowered his eyes without saying anything, as though recognizing that the evening had shifted beyond strategy and competition. Richard stepped away from the podium and approached us until only a few feet separated the three of us. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled. "For years, I have listened to polished presentations about leadership," he said. "Tonight, I have finally witnessed it." He placed a reassuring hand on Adrian's shoulder before looking at both of us. "A company can teach financial management. It can teach marketing and expansion. What it cannot teach is integrity. That must already exist." A quiet wave of applause began somewhere near the back of the ballroom. One pair of hands became several, then dozens, until the elegant room filled with genuine applause that sounded nothing like polite obligation. Standing beside Adrian, I realized that neither of us had won because we had played our roles well. We had won because, when the moment demanded honesty instead of performance, we finally chose to be exactly who we were. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling inside the ballroom had completely changed. The evening was no longer about polished speeches, business alliances, or carefully managed appearances. It had become something far more memorable. People were no longer discussing who had made the smartest strategic move. They were talking about honesty, Richard Sterling returned to the podium and allowed the room to settle before speaking again. For decades, he began, our family has measured success through expansion, occupancy rates, and financial reports. Those numbers matter. They always will. But tonight reminded me that no company survives for generations without something much harder to measure. Trust. He paused long enough for every person in the ballroom to absorb his words. Leadership is not proven when everything goes according to plan. Leadership is revealed when the plan falls apart. His eyes rested briefly on Adrian before continuing. Earlier this evening, I intended to announce the next chief executive officer based on months of evaluation. After what I have witnessed tonight, my decision has not changed. It has only become easier. The ballroom fell completely silent once again. Richard smiled proudly at his grandson. Adrian Sterling, you have demonstrated the courage to tell the truth even when that truth threatened everything you believed you wanted. You chose integrity over convenience, people over appearances, and honesty over personal ambition. Those are exactly the qualities this company requires. I am honored to announce that you will become the next chief executive officer of Sterling Hotels. This time the applause arrived instantly, louder than before and filled with genuine excitement. I looked toward Adrian, expecting relief, but instead I saw disbelief. He shook his head slightly, almost as though he had not prepared himself for this outcome. Richard stepped down from the stage and embraced his grandson with quiet affection. It was not the formal gesture of a chairman congratulating his successor. It was simply a grandfather expressing pride in the person standing before him. When they stepped apart, Richard turned toward me with a warm smile. Noah, I believe you have also earned something this evening. I looked around, confused. Sir, you reminded this family why hospitality exists in the first place. He continued speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. Every employee deserves the opportunity to grow regardless of where they begin. Beginning next semester, Sterling Hotels will establish the Carter Hospitality Scholarship, providing full financial assistance each year to students pursuing careers in hospitality management who demonstrate compassion, determination, and service to others. I was too stunned to respond. Only a week earlier I had been calculating whether I could afford another semester without taking on additional loans. Now an entire scholarship program would help students who faced the same challenges I had known. The emotion rising in my chest had nothing to do with money or recognition. It came from realizing that one honest conversation had inspired an opportunity that could change countless lives. As guests gathered to congratulate Adrian, several hotel employees quietly approached me as well. One housekeeper thanked me for reminding everyone that kindness mattered. A young front desk associate said she hoped to apply for the scholarship one day. Their words stayed with me far more than the applause ever could. Later that evening, after the ballroom had emptied and the photographers had finally packed away their cameras, Adrian and I stood together on a quiet terrace overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights reflected across Lake Michigan just as they had during so many evenings outside our apartment. The view was grander, but somehow it felt familiar. Adrian smiled softly before looking at me. I thought I was fighting to protect my future, he admitted. Instead, I discovered what I actually wanted my future to be. Standing beside him beneath the cool night sky, I realized that neither of us had walked into the Sterling Grand Hotel expecting our lives to change forever, yet somehow they already had. 6 months later, life looked completely different, yet somehow the most meaningful parts had remained exactly the same. Adrian officially stepped into his role as Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Hotels with the same quiet humility that had first made me trust him. Instead of spending his first weeks redesigning executive offices or announcing flashy initiatives, he traveled from property to property, introducing himself to housekeepers, front desk, associates, maintenance teams, and restaurant staff. He listened more than he spoke, took notes during every conversation, and remembered names the way he always had. Employees quickly realized that the new leader was not interested in impressive titles. He wanted every guest and every team member to feel valued. Watching him lead confirmed what I had already known long before anyone else had recognized it. His greatest strength had never been his last name. It had always been his heart. As for me, I graduated with my hospitality management degree only a few weeks after the gala. Standing in my cap and gown, I caught Adrian smiling from the audience beside Richard Sterling, who applauded just as enthusiastically as any proud family member. It was still difficult to believe that the scholarship carrying my last name had already received hundreds of applications from students across the country. Reading their stories reminded me of my own journey, and I quietly promised myself that I would always remain involved in selecting recipients who believed kindness belonged at the center of hospitality. Soon afterward, Adrian asked whether I would join Sterling Hotels as part of a guest experience development team. I accepted, not because of the company's reputation, but because I believed in the culture he was building. Together we visited hotels, spoke with employees, gathered ideas from guests, and searched for simple improvements that made people feel genuinely welcome. Some of our best ideas came during long drives between properties or over cups of coffee shared in small neighborhood diners rather than expensive boardrooms. Success, we discovered, often grew from ordinary conversations. Friends occasionally asked whether we had moved into a luxury penthouse overlooking the city after everything that had happened. The answer always made them laugh. We still lived in the same apartment with the squeaky hardwood floors, the stubborn coffee maker, and the refrigerator that continued buzzing like it had important opinions about life. We talked about moving someday, but neither of us felt any hurry. That little apartment had witnessed the beginning of everything that mattered. It reminded us that happiness had arrived long before promotions, recognition, or elegant hotel ballrooms entered our lives. One quiet Sunday morning, I stood at the stove making pancakes while Adrian washed fresh fruit beside the sink, exactly as we had done countless times before. Sunlight poured through the kitchen window, filling the tiny room with warmth. Adrian looked at me with the same gentle smile that had once calmed my nerves outside the Sterling Grand Hotel. "Do you ever think about how all of this started?" he asked. I laughed softly. "With a contract that lasted less than a weekend." He smiled and shook his head. "No, it started much earlier than that. It started every time you treated me like an ordinary person instead of someone carrying a famous last name." I reached across the counter and took his hand. "You never needed to pretend to be ordinary. You only needed someone willing to see the real you." He squeezed my hand gently as the pancakes finished cooking and the familiar sound of our old coffee maker echoed through the apartment once again. Looking around that small kitchen, I finally understood something that no amount of wealth could ever purchase. A beautiful house can offer comfort. A successful career can create opportunity. But home is the place where you are accepted without conditions, trusted without contracts, and loved without needing to become anyone other than yourself. And after everything we had been through, we had finally found ours together.